On the morning of what seemed to be an ordinary day in history, tragedy struck the nation. The day was September 11, 2001. Terrorists had unexpectedly crashed planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and targeted the White House. Why? Why did terrorists target these places? Why here? Why on this date?
It doesn't appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
To begin with, the most impacted target was the World Trade Center. It was a symbol of America's economic power. Not only that, but the World Trade Center controlled much of the world's trade. Anti-American terrorists did not like how the United States was able to control their economy and culture. The next target was the Pentagon. The Pentagon is a symbol of the U.S.'s military power. The U.S.'s military has bases worldwide, and anti-American terrorists felt as if their land was being invaded. Luckily, the building was not destroyed and stayed standing even after such an explosion. Lastly, and most importantly, they planned to attack the White House. The White House is the symbol across the world of our political power. Once again, terrorists did not like that the U.S. was spreading democracy around the world. The passengers of the hijacked United 93 plane thwarted this attack. The heroic passengers purposely crashed in a Pennsylvania field before an attack on the White House could occur. Unfortunately, none of the passengers survived. Those people will forever be remembered for preventing an even worse attack. Unfortunately, almost 3,000 innocent Americans died due to the attacks on 9/11. These people are truly in our hearts, whether or not we know them personally. On the morning of 9/11, no one had a clue that our nation would be forever impacted with pain for those who lost their lives and experienced the horror. Together, America will always grieve for the loss of friends, family on that horrific day in history. The leader of terrorists, Osama bin Laden, organized the horrific acts on 9/11. Why did he hate America so much? To begin with, the U.S.'s military presence in Saudi Arabia extremely offended him. Not only were our troops in Saudi Arabia, but the two holiest cities in Islam known as Mecca and Medina had our military presence there as well. To bin Laden, the presence of the American military in Saudi Arabia looked as if Christians were seeking to overtake Islam. Also, during the Persian Gulf War, Saudi Arabia allowed the U.S.'s military in their country to help them fight Iraq, which angered terrorists. Another thing that fueled bin Laden's hatred for America was our support of Israel. The U.S.'s military had aided Israel with assistance and supported them with military strength. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict also added onto the pile of reasons of hatred for the U.S. Islamic extremists also believed that Israel oppressed Muslims and took their land, only to increase their hatred. Next came the U.S. sanction or prohibition of trade on a country to supposedly weaken their economy. The U.S. thought the sanctions would destroy Iraq's economy. However, it did the opposite. It caused the citizens much more suffering than the government. Finally came a strike of terrorism. During the 1990s, there was an assassination attempt on George H.W. Bush by Saddam Hussein.
In response to this act of terror, the U.S. bombed Iraq. Because of this, many innocent civilians were killed.
Unfortunately, this was the beginning of the terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda, which translates to the base. They wanted to attack the U.S., and they would do just that. The rise of Al-Qaeda began with what was known as the Cold War. It lasted from 1949 to 1989. It was an ideological war fought between the U.S. democracy, capitalism, versus the Soviet Union's communism. There were many ways the Cold War was fought. One was the arms race. The U.S. and the USSR both began to develop better bombs and delivery systems. As bombs began to become more sophisticated, missiles were designed to launch nuclear bombs. Just when what seemed like the limit, the U.S. invented atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. They were so powerful that the USSR began what became known as the space race. This is where the U.S. and the USSR competed to have a better delivery system of weapons of mass destruction. The reason why it became known as the space race is because in 1957, the USSR put the first man in space. Shortly after, in 1969, the U.S. put the first man on the moon. The intention in the space race was to have nukes aimed directly for an area and have it dropped there to destruct everything. Next came the proxy wars. This is where wars were fought in separate countries, and the U.S. and the USSR supported opposing sides. Two wars were involved. One was the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, where America supported South Korea and the USSR supported North Korea. The Vietnam War was the second. It lasted from 1954 to 1975. It was when the U.S. supported the anti-communist forces and the USSR supported the communist forces. Shortly after came the Soviet-Afghan War, which was from 1979 to 1988. During this war, the USSR tried to spread communism into Afghanistan. The Afghan people, being Muslim, rebelled. People from other Muslim countries then went to Afghanistan to help fight against the USSR's spread of atheism. Muslims in other countries who wished to help fight were known as the Mujahideen, which Osama bin Laden was a part of. Soon enough, the US CIA began to give training, weapons, and money to help the Mujahideen fight the USSR. The Mujahideen used guerrilla war to fight the USSR, like ambushes and hit and runs. In 1988, the USSR pulled out of Afghanistan because they could not handle the war. The Mujahideen believed that they had won because of God's help, when in reality, our CIA helped them win. Shortly after pulling out of Afghanistan in 1989, the USSR fell. This made the Mujahideen believe that they could take down any superpower. With that, a spark was lit against America. That small spark was created way back in 1914 when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began. Little did people know this would end up being a reason why Osama hated the US. This is when World War I began involving many countries. The US, France, and Great Britain were against Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. Once the war began, Great Britain needed help
defeating the Ottoman Empire. So, they reached out to the Arab Palestinians and the Jewish Zionists for their help. In return, Great Britain promised the Jewish Zionists, who were Jews who wanted a country, Palestine, as their own land. Without thinking about the consequences, they promised the Arab Palestinians the same exact land if they won. With all this help by their side, Great Britain managed to win the war in 1918. Once this happened, they were able to take over Iraq and Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the Jews now wanted Palestine as promised. However, when they tried to move there, the Arab Palestinians fought them. Then, Great Britain stepped in and wouldn't allow any Jews to move to Palestine.
This led to an even bigger conflict. In 1939, World War II started. The Holocaust began, resulting in 12 million deaths. 6 million of these were Jews. When the tragedy finally ended, survivors and other European Jews had nowhere to stay because they weren't allowed to live in Palestine.
However, US, UN, and Great Britain ended up allowing them to live in Palestine after all. They established themselves as the State of Israel in 1948. The once happy Arab states were no longer so pleased. They were extremely angry at the countries that allowed the Jews to have their own state. This same year, the Arab states went to war. These states consisted of Egypt, Palestinians, Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. They attempted to defeat Israel with their attack, but they failed. Unfortunately for them, Israel had much better weapons than they did. Refusing to give up, the Arab states tried to attack again in 1967, but Israel saw their attack coming. As a result, Israel attacked first and won. Israel started to expand their land by taking the Gaza Strip and Sinai. This war happened so quickly, only lasting 6 days, so it was simply named the Six-Day War. However, in 1973, Egypt managed to regain control of Sinai during the Yom Kippur War. Even though they managed to retake Sinai, the Arab states still lost their war against Israel. From September 10th to September 17th in 1978, the Camp David Accords were held. During this week, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. Also, they established Israel as a permanent state on 9/11/1978. This made Islamic extremists very angry. This is why 9/11 was the day chosen for their attack on the United States.
Then, in 1979, the Soviet-Afghan War occurred, which then led to the Persian Gulf War in 1990. Saddam Hussein, who was under the control of Iraq, invaded Kuwait and threatened to invade Saudi Arabia as well. This caused the US to worry because if Hussein could take over Saudi Arabia, then he would be in control of 25% of the world's oil population. This could seriously mess up the economy if he abused his power. In order to prevent this from happening, the US offered Saudi Arabia protection. Saudi Arabia agreed and allowed the US to fight Iraq and station troops in their country. This made the Mujahideen furious. They felt that they should be the ones to protect Saudi Arabia instead of the US. This only made Osama's hatred for America worse. From this point, Osama was then completely against the US. Although Saudi Arabia ended up easily winning the war, the Mujahideen had already started orchestrating their attacks against the United States. The Mujahideen then split into two groups, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The Taliban was the government of Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda was an organization that tried to recruit people to fight for Islam. Ramzi Youssef, a person affiliated with Al-Qaeda, plotted their first pre-9/11 attack in 1993. He planned to take down the World Trade Center towers by using a bomb truck. He hoped that it would destroy the foundation of one tower, which would cause the other one to collapse. Luckily, this plan failed. However, 6 people did die and 1,000 others were injured. Only 6 months later, a famine in Somalia began. The U.S. tried to help by sending food, but it was being denied by local warlords. However, the U.S. still continued to try to help by sending troops over along with the United Nations. Al-Qaeda saw this as an opportunity to attack by shooting down a U.S. Black Hawk helicopter. This ended up killing 19 troops. This angered many Americans because their troops were dying in a war that didn't even concern them. As a result, the U.S. decided to pull out of Somalia. Bin Laden saw this as the U.S. being weak, so he and Al-Qaeda started to call the U.S. Paper Tiger.
A few years later, in 1998, Al-Qaeda attacked again. They bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. 224 people ended up dying, and over 4,000 were injured. Their last pre-attack was ambushing a USS Cole Navy ship, resulting in 17 troops' deaths and 100 people injured. Unfortunately, no one knew that these tragedies would lead to the biggest one of all, 9/11. 9/11 wasn't something that could just be forgotten. It had a huge effect on the U.S. in many different ways. For instance, this attack started the War of Terror. Unfortunately, it will never be possible to end this war, because in this case, terror is an idea, not a country. However, this wasn't the only war that came out of 9/11. 2 other wars began as well, one of which was the war in Afghanistan that started in 2001 and ended in 2012. The U.S. found out this was where Al-Qaeda was operating, so they stationed troops there. They also found out the Taliban was assisting Al-Qaeda. The U.S. wanted anyone helping terrorists to be attacked. The way they fought this war was through drones, which caused many innocent civilians' deaths. This led to even more people being angry with the U.S., which caused the war in Iraq to begin in 2003. The U.S. thought that Iraq, under Hussein, possessed weapons of mass destruction, so they began to worry that these weapons could be used for terrorism. However, they eventually figured out there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. However, Iraq is still rebuilding from when the war ended in 2010. War wasn't the only thing 9/11 caused. The U.S. started to suffer from a recession. They were already suffering from one before, but 9/11 just made it worse. The U.S. began to fear that they would be attacked again, so they spent billions of dollars on the military and to improve security. If terrorism wasn't an issue, this money could have been used for bigger and better things, such as growing the economy or improving education. Not only that, but the airline industry nearly fell apart, for people were terrified to fly. So, security was improved dramatically. Before 9/11, it wasn't necessary to take off your shoes, you could carry liquids, and there were no full body scans and pat-downs. However, in today's time, it would be nearly impossible to get something dangerous past security. Due to all this improvement, the cost of flying increased, but only for everyone's best interest. Another effect from 9/11 was the way U.S. began to perceive Muslims. Many people began to associate Muslims with terrorism. What people failed to realize was that there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, and less than 1% are Islamic extremists. In fact, most Muslims dislike bin Laden. Still, Americans discriminated against Muslims so much so that mosques received death threats. Also, in 2012, a Sikh temple was attacked by a white supremacist because he believed the people who were inside were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, even though that was completely untrue. Lastly, Osama bin Laden was killed May 2, 2011. He managed to stay hidden for 10 years. However, the U.S. never gave up looking for him until SEAL Team 6 managed to find him in a town in Pakistan called Abbottabad. Although Osama's death was a great moment for the U.S., the damage he was able to do to our country is irreversible. He brought devastation to many, but because of him, the United States was forced to become stronger. So when you think of 9/11, don't think of the sadness. Think of how strong the United States has become and how we will never back down. 9/11, never forget, never surrender.